Porn addiction has ruined our marriage. Imagine being married nearly 30 years, building a life, raising children, sharing a bed, sharing memories, sharing routines, thinking that whatever problems you had at the end of the day, you two still were best friends. And then one day you go looking for birthday pictures. And instead you find out that for years, the man laying next to you has been living a secret sexual life in the same house as you. Not out in the open, not honestly, but right under your nose. And the deeper you look, the uglier it gets. Today's story is not just about porn. It's about what porn addiction does to a marriage over time when it's hidden, denied, minimized, and protected. Because that's the part people miss. People hear porn addiction and sometimes they reduce it to a bad habit, a private struggle, a weakness, a man looking at things online. But in a marriage, especially one this long, it's not just about what someone watched. It becomes about deception. It becomes about sexual withdrawal. It becomes about criticism, irritability, secrecy, dishonesty, deflection, gaslighting, and emotional abandonment. And what makes the story so painful is that this woman did not think she had a dead marriage. She thought she had a beautiful marriage. That's why this hits so hard. Let's get into it. She begins like this, quote, "My husband has a porn addiction. I discovered it our first year of marriage, and we've been married almost 28 years now," unquote. Stop right there. That one line already tells you this marriage has been carrying a hidden fracture from almost the very beginning. This is not a late stage surprise after 27 years. This issue was introduced early. That matters because it means she spent almost the entire marriage adapting to something she never fully healed from. And that's what many spouses do when betrayal enters early but doesn't fully explode right away. They don't always leave. They adjust. They rationalize. They lower the alarm inside themselves just enough to survive the relationship they've already emotionally invested in. And she says exactly that, quote, "I know that he was struggling with it off and on throughout the years, and I have even justified it to a certain point because of my own survival," unquote. That is a brutal, honest sentence. Because of my own survival. That means she is not talking like someone who felt safe and respected and simply chose mercy. She's talking like someone who had to make the situation emotionally livable. That is different. That is not peace. That is adaptation. That is a wife mentally negotiating with pain because fully confronting it may have threatened the entire structure of her life. And then she explains the cycle, quote, "Anytime I find out about his porn use, he's been very remorseful and has wanted to change," unquote. This is where people listening need to pay attention because remorse and change are not the same thing. A lot of marriages get stuck right here. Remorse can be real. Tears can be real. Shame can be real. Apologies can be real. A man can absolutely hate what he's been doing, feel disgusted with himself, beg forgiveness, mean every word in the moment, and still not actually change. That is one of the cruelest parts of this addiction. The remorse feels emotionally convincing enough to calm the injured spouse. But remorse without sustained recovery is not repair. It's just another cycle. And now, after all these years, she is saying that clearly. Quote, "I am realizing that never really happened." That sentence is bigger than it sounds because she's not just saying he relapsed. She's saying the story I told myself about our healing was false. That's much deeper. That is much more devastating because now she is not only grieving what he did, she is grieving the version of the marriage she thought she had recovered. Then she says, I'm not a micromanager and I don't like to snoop, so I have gone about 15 years now with trusting him that he's telling me the truth, and now I realize that was a mistake. Stop right there. This is where a lot of betrayed spouses turn their pain inward. How was I so stupid? How did I not know? Why did I trust him? What is wrong with me? And that is one of the ugliest side effects of long term deception. The guilty party sins, but the innocent party starts feeling stupid. That's backwards, but it happens all the time because trust after betrayal starts to feel like foolishness. And what she is wrestling with here is not just anger at him, it's humiliation at herself. She trusted him like a wife is supposed to. She didn't want to police a grown man. She didn't want to turn the marriage into supervision. She thought trust was healthy. Now she feels like trust made her blind. That is a terrible psychological injury because once that happens, even if the marriage survives, the betrayed spouse often loses trust not only in their partner but in their own judgment. That's one of the deepest wounds in stories like this. Not can I trust him, but can I trust me when I missed this for so long? That is where people in the audience will feel this because that is not a small wound. That shakes your total foundation. Then she starts remembering old moments. Quote, how could I be so stupid? I now recall all the times that he couldn't get it up and he would tell me he was just tired, or those nights he would make me up and cry and tell me he was really sorry and he would do better by me, unquote. This is where the story becomes psychologically brutal because now hindsight starts rewriting memory. And that is one of the most painful stages after a discovery like this. Everything gets reinterpreted. Every strange moment, every awkward sexual encounter, every unexplained emotional break, every vague apology, every defensive answer, every time something felt off but got brushed aside. Now all of it comes back with a different meaning. And when that happens, the betrayed spouse starts to feel like the whole marriage has been contaminated by hidden context. This is why secret sexual behavior destroys so much more than trust in the present. It reaches backward. It invades old memories. A birthday now feels different. A vacation now feels different. Moments in bed now feel different. Arguments feel different. Tears feel different. Because now she knows those tears were not random emotional sensitivity. Those were the tears of a man carrying a hidden sexual life he would not confess. And listen to this part. Quote, I would ask him what he meant by that, but he never really would tell me. That is the key right there. He gave her emotional smoke, but not truth. He gave her enough remorse to keep her engaged, but not enough honesty to let her make an informed decision. That matters because partial confession still manipulates reality. When someone knows the truth and the spouse is not participating in the marriage on equal terms. They're making decisions inside a false reality. That is betrayal. Then she explains how this addiction played out in his behavior. Quote, I know now that he has been ashamed of his addiction for many years, and the way it plays out with him is he becomes very grumpy and critical and secretive and gaslights me, unquote. Now we get into the real cause. This is where you stop reducing the issue to porn and start seeing what the addiction did to the emotional climate of the marriage, because addictions do not stay neatly contained in one corner of a relationship. They leak, they change tone, they change energy, they change how the addicted person responds to stress, intimacy, accountability, and vulnerability. And in this case, shame turned into irritation, secret behavior turned into criticism, avoidance turned into emotional distance, and fear of exposure turned into gaslighting. That means she was not dealing with the man privately struggling in silence. She was living with the emotional fallout of his secret for years. And look at the sentence after that, telling me that I'm just imagining things when I asked if things were okay between us. That is where the injury deepens, because she was detecting something real. The relationship was off. The intimacy was off. The emotional connection was off. The warmth was off. And instead of being told the truth, she was told her perception was the problem. That is one of the most destabilizing things a spouse can experience, when your spirit is picking up on the real fracture, but the person causing it keeps telling you it's all in your head. You're crazy. That's how people start disconnecting from their own instincts. That's how they start second guessing themselves. That's how intuition gets trained into silence. And over time, that does not just create marital pain, it creates identity confusion. Because now the wife who once felt emotionally perceptive starts asking, am I too sensitive? Am I crazy? Am I needy? Am I imagining these patterns? But she wasn't imagining it. She was living inside a lie. Then she says, he's been telling me that I am the source of our communication problems, when now I know he just couldn't face me. That line deserves a full stop because that is one of the nastiest features of hidden addiction in marriage. The guilty party, the guilty partner often makes the healthy partner feel defective. Not always intentionally in some grand calculated way. Sometimes it's just the self protection of shame, but the effect is the same. He could not bear to face what he was doing. So instead of carrying the full weight of his own secret, he displaced some of that tension on her. Now she's the difficult one. Now she is the problem in communication. Now she is the one bringing tension in the room. That is deeply unfair, and it's important for the audience to hear why. Because once blame shifting gets introduced, the betrayed spouse is not only carrying their own hurt, they're carrying false guilt too. So now instead of saying something is wrong with him, they start wondering, what am I doing wrong? That misdirection can steal years from someone. Years. Because while she's trying to become easier to talk to, warmer, less questioning, more understanding, more sexually available, more patient, the actual problem is still living in secrecy untouched. That's one of the reasons the injured party often feels rage after discovery, not just because of the behavior itself, but because they now see how much emotional labor they poured into fixing a relationship problem that was never actually theirs to fix. Then she describes the discovery that blew all of this open. Quote, I was trying to retrieve some photos of my birthday and found a bunch of photos that looked like me. Unquote. This is such a painful detail because it starts with innocence. She's not investigating. She's not playing detective. She's looking for birthday pictures, normal wife behavior, normal life behavior, and then she stumbles into the hidden archive. That matters for storytelling because it shows the secret was not discovered through obsession or paranoia. It was discovered by accident, and what she finds is eerie. Not women who look wildly different from her, not some obvious fantasy category that immediately creates distance. No, women who look almost identical to her. That is psychologically disturbing in every specific way because it introduces a kind of twisted duplication. She thought she was enough. In many ways, she even fit the exact visual type he was chasing. And still, he sought substitutes. That's what makes this part cut so deeply. She says, quote, in fact, I didn't know what I was looking at first because I thought they were me, unquote. That line is devastating because it tells you how close the imitation was. And now she is not just hurt. She's disorientated. What exactly was he seeking? If these women look like me, if I have given him access to me, if I have been sexually adventurous, if I had never withheld myself, then what is he actually chasing? That is the question underneath her pain. And that question matters because this is where many betrayed spouses start blaming their appearance, their age, their body, their sexual openness, their desirability. But this story actually shows why that interpretation is too simple. This is not about a wife failing to satisfy a husband. This was a man conditioned by compulsive novelty, fantasy, control, secrecy, and compartmentalization. That's different, very different. Because she's saying, in essence, I was available, I was willing, I was attractive, I was adventurous, I was a real wife. So why was real intimacy still not enough? And the painful answer is addiction changes the appetite. It's not just about beauty. It's not just about sex. It's not about access. It becomes about the ritual, the secrecy, the stimulation, the chase, the fantasy layer, the compartmentalization world where no real person can compete because the point is no longer connection. The point becomes escape. That is why many spouses suffer so much trying to out. compete porn. You cannot outcompete an escape hatch by becoming prettier, sexier, younger, more available, or more daring, because the competition isn't with another real relationship. It's with a private system of fantasy and emotional avoidance. Then she goes into detail about herself, and some people might hear that and think she's kind of bragging. She's not. She's pleading for the logic to make sense. She's saying, I took care of myself. I stayed attractive. I stayed adventurous. I welcomed sexual adventures. I didn't deprive him. I didn't shut him out. I wasn't cold. I wasn't withholding. I wasn't prudish. Why is that important? Because many people in this situation secretly ask that same question. Many women, if I had been more sexual, would this have stopped? If I had stayed prettier, would this have stopped? If I had been more adventurous, would this have stopped? And her story becomes powerful right there because she removes those excuses. She's essentially saying, by the world's standards, I gave him everything he might claim he was missing. And still, this existed. That is why this story still hits listeners hard, because it exposes the lie that porn addiction in marriage can always be explained by the spouse's failing somehow. No, sometimes the spouse is loving, present, willing, beautiful, sexually open, emotionally connected, and addiction still thrives. Why? Because addiction is not fed by gratitude, it's fed by compulsion, and that distinction matters. Then the story takes an even stranger turn. Quote, also in some cases, he swapped out their faces with mine, unquote. This is where the analysis has to slow down because this is not just porn use anymore. This is a man fusing fantasy women with his wife's identity. And psychologically, that tells us a lot. It suggests he wanted the stimulation of fantasy while still overlaying it with the familiarity and emotional significance of his wife. That is deeply disturbing for her because it feels like imitation intimacy. Not real intimacy, not honest desire, but an artificial mashup of wife and fantasy object. And that matters because it takes a personhood and reduces it to imagery, into a face, into a body type, into a sexual template. That is humiliating. And that kind of discovery can make a spouse feel dehumanized in a very specific way. Not merely rejected, replicated, copied, replaced by lookalikes and edited bodies that mimic her enough to blur the line. That is why she sounds so disorientated. She's not just saying he looked at other women, she's saying he turned me into a category. That is a much deeper violation. Then comes another layer. Quote, not only that, but I found photos of a mutual friend of ours, unquote. Now, this is where private fantasy spills into the real world. And that changes the emotional danger because now it's no longer some distant screen based behavior with anonymous people. Now it's someone in their life, their actual inner circle, someone in their home, someone she knows. And she says he has screenshots of the friend in a swimsuit and had edited some of her clothing away. That is a major line crossing moment. Why? Because now the addiction is moved from passive viewing into active violation of a real person's image. He is no longer just consuming content. He is sexualizing and digitalizing, undressing a woman from their real life. That's a different level of creepiness. And the wife feels that instinctively. And then she says some of the photos were taken in their house, their own house. That part is powerful because it contaminates the safety of her home. Not home is safe anymore. Home is somewhere where he took pictures. Now home becomes a place where he was covertly creating sexual material out of ordinary life. That is why this kind of discovery makes people sick, because the secret is no longer contained to somewhere else. It was here in her house, in her room, in the marriage, around the wife, around the family. That is a violation. And then she says, quote, I have actually asked him point blank about her more than once, unquote. There it is again. Her intuition was right. That matters. She noticed the attention. She noticed the weirdness. She noticed the change in his energy when the friend showed up. And what happened? He denied it. So now the betrayal is not only sexual, it's episthetic, meaning he made her doubt what she correctly perceived. That is why discovery often brings not only pain but fury, because she realizes, I knew I asked him. He lied. That combination is explosive. And then the story reaches its most shocking point. She finds a sexual video of her own sister on his phone. A video that should never have been kept, never revisited, never privately consumed. This is where the moral violation becomes impossible to soften. Because now the injury is not only infidelity adjacent and not only addiction related, now it crosses into family violation. And for her, that likely creates disgust on top of heartbreak. Disgust matters here because disgust can kill desire faster than anger ever could. Anger still argues. Anger still wants answers. Anger still engages. Disgust withdraws. Disgust pulls back. Disgust says, I do not know this man. Disgust says, this is not safe. Disgust says, something here feels contaminated. This is why this discovery is so severe, because now she is not only questioning whether he has a sexual addiction, she's questioning his boundaries, his integrity, his character, and the moral structure of the man she married. And she says, essentially, I can't believe it. That sentence sounds simple, but it means the man in my head and the man revealed by this phone cannot be reconciled. Cannot be. That is shattering. Then the story takes an even more bizarre turn. She says that even though she thought she would not want sex with him after all of this, she finds herself trying harder to be sexually exciting. And then she says, I feel so pathetic. No, she feels human. That is a trauma response, and it needs to be explained that way because a lot of betrayed spouses do this and then hate themselves afterwards. They think, why am I chasing the person who wounded me? Why am I performing harder after being humiliated? Why do I want more closeness from the same person who broke my heart? Because betrayal often triggers competition, panic bonding, and attachment desperation. The injured spouse doesn't feel just anger. They feel threatened, feel replaced. They feel compared. They feel sexually destabilized. So the nervous system sometimes says, reclaim him, reconnect now, prove your matter, outshine the threat, restore the bond. That is not panic. That is the body trying to survive a relational injury. But it's important because it also shows how addiction can turn a wife into someone auditioning inside her own marriage. That's tragic. A woman married nearly 30 years should not feel like she has to outperform screenshots, edited bodies, and fantasy images just to stabilize her place. That is what addiction did here. It made the marriage emotionally degrading. Then she says something else that matters. Quote, he has given me all his passwords, which I am glad for, but also hate. I don't want to be his mother. Unquote. This is one of the things betrayed spouses resent the most. Recovery often creates a new arrangement where the injured spouse gets access, oversight, transparency, passwords, tracking, disclosures. And yes, that may be necessary, but it also creates a rotten emotional dynamic. Now the wife becomes a monitor, checker, compliance officer, accountability partner, watcher, and that is exhausting because she didn't marry a son, she married a husband. She does not want her role in the relationship to become sexual probation officer. That is another hidden cost of addiction recovery and marriage. Even when the addicted spouse finally starts doing the right things, the betrayed spouse may hate the life that repair requires. Not because transparency is bad, but because it changes the dignity of the relationship. Now love has surveillance in it. Now peace requires checking. Now trust is no longer natural. That is grief too. Then she says the last 5 days have been the hardest he's ever worked. Deleted apps, contacted a counselor, open access, communicated better. That's good. It matters. It should not be dismissed. But for the audience, now this is where analysis has to be mature. 5 days of effort is not the same thing as trustworthiness. It may be a beginning, a real beginning, a helpful beginning, but after nearly 3 decades of deception, cycles, 5 days is not enough to repair the nervous system of the injured spouse. That's why she immediately asked the real question. What happens when I leave for work trips? What happens when I go to the store? What happens when life becomes ordinary again? That's the right questions. Because crisis behavior is one thing, character over time is another. Anybody can look transformed when the marriage is on fire and abandonment is 1 week away. The real issue is who he is when the panic dies down, who he is when she's not checking, who he is when he is stressed, who he is when he is bored, when he's ashamed, when he has secrecy and it becomes possible again. That is the true test, and she knows that. That's why her fear is not irrational at all. She's not just afraid of relapse. She's afraid of wasting another 10 years on a man who can perform remorse beautifully but cannot sustain truth. That is a completely reasonable fear. One of the saddest lines in this whole story is, quote, "We have beautiful children, and I thought we had a beautiful marriage, and I thought we were best friends." That is the grief line because it's not just a woman asking whether addiction treatment works. This is a woman mourning the collapse of a marriage she lived inside. I thought we were best friends. That line hurts because friendship implies honesty. Friendship implies mutuality. Friendship implies the world may be hard, but this one person is real with me. When a spouse says, "I thought we were best friends," what they often mean is, "I did not know I was alone in a room I believed we shared." It's devastating because now she has to figure out whether the marriage was fake, partly real, mostly real, or real but corrupted. And that kind of ambiguity is psychologically exhausting. It's often easier to leave a clearly cruel person than to process a loving person whose secret life has made the whole relationship feel unreliable. That complexity is why stories like this deserve deeper analysis. Pain is not simple. The offender is not one dimensional. The wife is not merely angry. She's grieving, comparing, competing, doubting, revising memory, and trying not to lose her mind. The red flags here are not just he watched porn, they're much deeper. He used remorse as a recurring emotional reset without real change. He let her trust become the hiding place for his addiction. He gaslit her when she sensed disconnection. He blamed her for communication problems that were being created by his secret life. His addiction escalated into real world sexualization of people in their circles. He stored sexual material involving their sister, crossing a major moral line. He conditioned her to compete for validation inside her own marriage. He turned transparency, once broken, into a burden she now has to manage. That's why this story is not shallow, and that's why this analysis cannot be shallow either. This is a story about a woman discovering that what she called a marriage, he had partly turned into a compartment. And now she has to decide whether a man who may finally be telling the truth is worth rebuilding with all these years of making her feel wrong for sensing it. That's the story. But this is the continued analysis. There's one moment in this story that is extremely important and easy to miss. She says something that sounds small, but it reveals a lot about what betrayal does to someone psychologically. She says that after discovering everything, even though she thought she would not want to be intimate with him anymore, she actually finds herself trying harder to be sexually exciting. And then she says something heartbreaking. Quote, "I feel so pathetic," unquote. This is one of the most misunderstood reactions to betrayal because people assume that when someone is deeply hurt, they will pull away. But that is not always what happens. Very often, the opposite happens. When someone discovers that their partner has been sexually investigating attention from somewhere else, porn, another person, fantasy, the injured partner's brain often goes into competition mode, not consciously, not emotionally. It becomes, am I not attractive enough? Am I not exciting enough? What do those women have that I don't? And what makes this part of her story so tragic is that she is describing someone who already believed she was giving everything. She says she stayed in shape, she stayed adventurous, sexually open, never rejected intimacy. She even enjoyed being daring in a relationship. So when someone like that discovers a hidden sexual life, the damage cuts deep. because now the mind starts asking a question that feels impossible to answer. If I gave you everything, why was that not enough? And this is where the audience needs to understand something very clearly. Porn addiction in long marriages is rarely about the spouse being inadequate. It's all about the compulsive novelty and escape. And those two things operate very differently than real intimacy. Real intimacy involves vulnerability, connection, responsibility, emotional presence. Porn addiction removes all of that. It creates a private world where there's no expectations, no emotional work, no real partner to disappoint, just stimulation. And over time, that stimulation trains the brain to want more novelty, more intensity, more secrecy. That's why so many spouses get stuck in a trap where they keep trying to outperform the addiction. More sex, more excitement, more availability, more experimentation. But addiction doesn't work like that in normal relationships. You cannot outcompete fantasy by becoming better because fantasy is not competing on the same playing field. Fantasy is escape. Another extremely painful element in this story is the gaslighting she describes. For years, she asked if things were okay. For years, she sensed something was off. She was told she was imagining things. That is one of the most damaging experiences a spouse can go through because someone repeatedly denies reality while hiding something. The other partner begins to lose trust, not only in them, but in their own instincts. Think about what that does over time. She begins questioning herself. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm causing problems. Meanwhile, the actual problem is continuing behind the scenes. The dynamic can steal years from someone's life because instead of confronting the real issue, the spouse spends that time trying to fix themselves. That's one reason discovery often creates so much anger, not just because of the addiction itself, but because of the years spent doubting one's own intuition. The other strange detail in this story is that many of the photos she found looked almost identical to her. And that confused her deep because it creates a question that sounds simple, but is actually psychologically complicated. If he wanted women who looked like her, why not just me? And that question is actually very common in addiction cases. Addiction is not always about wanting someone different. Sometimes it's about wanting a version of a person that requires nothing emotionally. The images don't argue. They don't feel hurt. They don't ask questions. They don't expect honesty. They don't require emotional presence. They exist purely as stimulation. That's why even someone who has a loving, attractive, adventurous partner can still fall into that cycle. But the addiction is not replacing the spouse with someone better. It's replacing real connection with controlled fantasy. Then we get to the most shocking part of the story, the video involving her sister. That moment crosses into a completely different emotional category because now the betrayal is not just about strangers online. It involves family. That discovery can create something very different from anger, disgust. And disgust is powerful. Disgust can destroy attraction instantly. It changes the way someone looks at their partner. It changes the way someone imagines the future because now the injured spouse is not only questioning their loyalty, they're questioning their moral boundaries. And that's something much bigger. So now this woman finds herself in a very complicated position. Her husband is finally doing everything he should have done years ago. He has contacted a counselor. He has deleted apps. He's given her access. He says he'll do whatever it takes, but the real question she asks is the one that matters. What happens when she's not there, when she leaves the house, when she goes to work, when life becomes normal? Because the real test of discovery is not how someone behaves during a crisis. The real test is how they behave when no one is watching. One of the saddest lines in the story is this: I thought we had a beautiful marriage. That's the real grief. She's not just angry, she's mourning the version of the marriage she believed she was in. The friendship, the trust, the partnership, and now she has to decide something incredibly difficult. Whether the man she thought she knew is still there, or whether the secret life has changed the meaning of their entire relationship. That's the crossroads she's standing at now.